You wake up to the sound of church bells echoing across a bustling medieval town. The year is 850 CE, and you're about to discover that everything you thought you knew about the Dark Ages is wrong. The air is crisp with morning dew, and already the cobblestone streets below your window are alive with activity. Merchants are setting up their stalls, calling out in a mixture of Latin, local vernacular, and even Arabic. Because yes, this is a cosmopolitan world where ideas, goods, and knowledge flow freely across continents. You dress carefully in your woolen tunic, dyed a rich blue that would make modern fashion designers weep with envy, and step into a world that Hollywood has convinced you was nothing but mud, ignorance, and despair. But here's the thing. You're about to spend a day in one of history's most innovative, culturally rich, and intellectually vibrant periods. Welcome to the real medieval world, where the Dark Ages were anything but dark. Now, before we dive into your medieval adventure, let's talk about how this whole Dark Ages nonsense got started. Picture this. It's the 1300s, and a bunch of Italian intellectuals are sitting around Florence, probably sipping wine and feeling very superior about themselves. They look back at the previous few centuries and think, wow, those people were so backward compared to us brilliant Renaissance folks. These Renaissance writers, led by guys like Petrarch, coined the term Dark Ages to describe the period roughly from 500. In their minds, classical civilization had fallen with Rome, and then Europe just sat around in ignorance until they came along to save the day. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of OK Boomer, except directed at an entire millennium. But here's where it gets really interesting, and really wrong. These Renaissance scholars were looking at history through a very specific lens. They cared about classical Latin literature, certain types of art, and particular philosophical tradition. It would be like judging the entire 20th century based solely on whether people still wrote with quill pens. The Enlightenment thinkers of the 1700s made things even worse. Voltaire and his crew were so busy promoting reason over religion that they painted the entire medieval period as a time when the Catholic Church suppressed all learning and progress. Again, it was less about historical accuracy and more about making a point about their own era. You reach for your morning bread, freshly baked in one of the town's many bakeries regulated by guild standards that would make modern food safety inspectors proud, and you can't help but chuckle at the irony. The very period they called dark was when Europe was building the foundations of everything from universities to banking systems to representative government. You step out into the main square, and immediately you're struck by something that would shock most people today. This place is absolutely buzzing with intellectual energy. The local cathedral school is just letting out its morning lecture, and students are spilling into the streets, debating points of theology, philosophy, and natural science in Latin, the universal language of educated Europe. But wait, there's more. You notice a group of scholars huddled around a table outside the monastery, poring over a manuscript. As you get closer, you realize they're working on a translation of Aristotle's Physics, not from Latin but from Arabic. Because here's something that might blow your mind. Much of classical Greek knowledge survived the fall of Rome, not in Europe but in the Islamic world, and it's now flowing back through places like Spain and Sicily. The air smells like fresh bread, leather, and parchment. Lots of parchment, because contrary to popular belief, the medieval world was absolutely obsessed with books and learning. You pass a scriptorium where monks are carefully copying texts. But they're not just preserving religious work. They're copying everything from agricultural manuals to mathematical treatises to ancient Roman comedies. You dress more carefully this morning because you're planning to visit the local lord's court, and fashion actually matters here. Medieval people weren't walking around in burlap sacks. They loved color, texture, and style. Your blue tunic is complemented by a red cloak fastened with a silver brooch that was probably made by craftsmen whose techniques were just as sophisticated as anything produced today. Now let's address the elephant in the room. or rather the mud in the streets. Yes, medieval towns could be dirty by modern standards, but they weren't the sewage-filled nightmares of popular imagination. Most towns had regulations about waste disposal, street cleaning, and even noise control. London in 1300 had street cleaning laws that were more comprehensive than many modern cities. You make your way to the local monastery and prepare to have your mind completely blown. Because if medieval Europe had a Silicon Valley, it was right here in these religious communities that Hollywood loves to portray as centers of ignorance and superstition. The first thing you notice is the noise, not the peaceful silence you expected, but the sound of genuine industry. There's hammering from the metalworking shop, the scratch of quills from the scriptorium, the bubbling of liquids from what can only be described as a chemistry lab, and animated discussions in multiple languages echoing from the school. You meet Brother Thomas, who greets you not with a mumbled blessing, but with an excited explanation of his latest project. He's been experimenting with different lens combinations and thinks he might be able to make distant objects appear closer. In other words, you're watching the development of the telescope, not in Renaissance Italy, but in medieval Europe centuries earlier than most people think. The monastery library is absolutely staggering. Thousands of volumes line the walls, covering everything from astronomy to medicine to agriculture. But here's the kicker. Many of these books aren't even Christian texts. They're preserving and copying works by Muslim scholars, Jewish philosophers, ancient Greek scientists, and contemporary thinkers from across the known world. Brother Marcus shows you his pride and joy, a mechanical clock he's been working on. Yes, you heard that right. Sophisticated mechanical clocks were being developed in medieval monasteries centuries before most people think mechanical timekeeping existed. The gearwork is intricate, the mathematics complex, and the precision remarkable. You reach for one of the manuscripts on display, and Brother Thomas explains that it's a translation of an Islamic text on optics, which builds on Greek theories which incorporates Indian mathematical concepts. This isn't a dark age. This is a cosmopolitan intellectual renaissance that spans continents and cultures. The monastery's medical texts are particularly impressive. These monks have detailed anatomical drawings, surgical procedures, and pharmaceutical knowledge that rivals anything from the ancient world. They're performing cataract surgery, setting complex bone fractures, and yes, even doing a form of anesthesia using combinations of herbs that actually work. But perhaps most impressive is the agricultural innovation happening here. The monasteries were Europe's agricultural research centers, developing new plowing techniques, crop rotation systems, and breeding programs that would revolutionize food production. The three-field system, the heavy plow, the horse collar, these aren't ancient innovations. They're cutting-edge medieval technology that made possible the population growth and urbanization that would define later European development. Now you make your way to what might be the most revolutionary institution of the medieval world, the university. And yes, universities were a medieval invention. The University of Bologna was founded around 1088, the University of Paris around 1150. These weren't just centers of religious instruction. They were comprehensive institutions of higher learning that would be recognizable to any modern student. You enter the main lecture hall at the University of Paris, and immediately you're struck by the energy. Students from across Europe, and I mean across Europe, from Scotland to Sicily, from Poland to Portugal, are gathered to hear lectures on everything from law to medicine to natural philosophy. The language of instruction is Latin, which means a student from England can take notes alongside one from Hungary, and they can debate points with perfect mutual understanding. The professor, we'll call him Master Guillaume, is delivering a lecture on Aristotelian physics. But he's not just repeating ancient wisdom. He's critiquing it, building on it, arguing with it. This is scholasticism in action, the medieval method of learning that emphasized critical thinking, logical argument and systematic doubt. Sound familiar? It should. It's the foundation of the modern scientific method. You take notes on a piece of paper. Yes, paper, not parchment. Paper technology came to Europe from the Islamic world through Spain and Sicily. And by the 13th century, paper mills were operating across the continent. Information was becoming democratized in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the printing press. The curriculum is surprisingly modern. Students study the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. But they also delve into advanced topics like optics, mechanics, and what we would now call early chemistry. The medical school is particularly impressive. Students are dissecting human cadavers, studying circulation, and learning surgical techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern operating room. But here's what really drives home how wrong the Dark Ages narrative is. These students are arguing, constantly. Medieval education wasn't about memorizing received wisdom. It was about developing the skills to question, analyze, and debate. The disputatio, or formal debate, was a central part of university life. Students were expected to be able to argue any side of any question, to find flaws in authoritative texts, and to construct their own logical argument. You dress in the academic robes that mark you as a university student. Robes that, by the way, are still worn at graduation ceremonies today. The tradition is unbroken from medieval times, just like the structure of university education itself. Lectures, seminars, examinations, degrees. The whole system that defines higher education today. You leave the university and enter the marketplace. And immediately, you realize you're not in some isolated backward European village. You're in a node of a global trading network that spans from Greenland to Indonesia, from Russia to Morocco. The Dark Ages were actually the birth of the first truly global economy. The merchants you meet aren't dealing in just local goods. There's silk from China, spices from Indonesia, furs from Russia, amber from the Baltic, silver from Bohemia, and books from Cordoba. The level of international trade and cultural exchange would impress even a modern globalization enthusiast. You reach for a coin to make a purchase, and notice something interesting. It's not crude and primitive, but precisely minted with complex designs and accurate weight standards. Medieval coinage was remarkably sophisticated, and the development of credit systems, banking, and even early forms of insurance were revolutionizing commerce. The merchant you're dealing with casually mentions that he's expecting a shipment from his business partner in Constantinople, who's received goods from a contact in Baghdad, who trades regularly with merchants from India. This isn't a simple local economy. It's a complex international commercial network that requires sophisticated mathematics, logistics, and communication systems. But it's not just goods that are being traded. It's ideas, technologies, and knowledge. The merchant shows you a mechanical device he picked up in Islamic Spain. It's an astrolabe, used for navigation and astronomical calculation. He's planning to have the local craftsmen figure out how to reproduce it, because there's clearly a market for such sophisticated instruments. You notice that the marketplace isn't just economically sophisticated. It's also surprisingly regulated and organized. There are guilds controlling quality standards, municipal authorities regulating weights and measures, and even early forms of consumer protection. The guild system, far from being a backward restriction on trade, was actually an early form of quality control and professional standards that protected both producers and consumers. The level of specialization is remarkable. There aren't just generic craftsmen. There are specialists in specific types of metalwork, particular textile techniques, precision instrument making, and even early forms of engineering. The medieval economy was creating the kind of specialized, skilled workforce that we associate with modern industrial societies. You can't visit a medieval town without seeing its crown jewel, the cathedral. And what you're looking at isn't just a religious building. It's one of the most sophisticated engineering and architectural projects in human history. Gothic cathedrals were the skyscrapers of their era, pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible. The cathedral currently under construction has been in progress for several decades, and will probably take several more to complete. But what's happening here is essentially a massive engineering research project, with innovations in structural engineering, material science, and construction management that wouldn't be out of place in a modern building project. You meet Master Pierre, the cathedral's architect, and he's not some religious mystic working from divine inspiration. He's a trained professional with a deep understanding of mathematics, engineering, and material science. He shows you his plans, precise geometric drawings that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of structural forces, weight distribution, and architectural proportion. The flying buttress system he's designed is a marvel of engineering that allows the walls to soar to unprecedented heights, while remaining structurally sound. This isn't accidental or traditional. It's innovative engineering based on careful calculation and experimentation. Medieval architects were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with stone construction in ways that wouldn't be equaled until the development of steel frame buildings. But it's not just the engineering that's impressive, it's the project management. This cathedral project requires coordinating hundreds of specialized craftsmen, managing supply chains that stretch across Europe, and maintaining consistent quality standards over decades of construction. The organizational skills required are staggering. You reach for one of the architectural drawings, and Master Pierre explains that he's been corresponding with other cathedral architects across Europe, sharing techniques and innovation. There's a network of architectural knowledge that spans the continent, with builders learning from each other and constantly improving their method. The sculptures in stained glass windows aren't just decorative. They're sophisticated works of art that require advanced techniques in metalworking, chemistry, and optical science. The stained glass makers are working with color theories and light refraction principles that demonstrate a deep understanding of optics. The cathedral also serves as a center of learning and culture. The cathedral school trains not just priests, but administrators, lawyers, and scholars. The library contains one of the largest collections of books in the region. Regular lectures and debates are held in the cathedral spaces. This isn't just a religious building. It's a cultural and intellectual center that rivals any modern institution. Your final stop is the local Lord's Court, and you're about to discover that medieval government was far more sophisticated and participatory than most people imagine. The stereotype of tyrannical feudal lords ruling over oppressed peasants is largely a myth. The reality was much more complex and in many ways more democratic than later periods. You arrive during a court session, and what you see looks remarkably like a modern legal proceeding. There are established procedures, rules of evidence, trained legal professionals, and a systematic approach to justice that draws on both Roman law and local custom. Medieval law wasn't arbitrary or barbaric. It was highly developed and surprisingly fair. The Lord himself isn't some illiterate warrior, but an educated administrator who speaks multiple languages, understands complex legal principles, and manages what is essentially a complex business enterprise. His court includes trained lawyers, accountants, secretaries, and advisors who help him navigate the intricacies of medieval law and administration. But here's the really interesting part. This isn't an absolute monarchy. The Lord's power is constrained by law, custom, and the rights of his subjects. Peasants have legal rights that are protected by courts. Towns have charters that guarantee their freedoms. Even the king's power is limited by law and the consent of the governed. You witness a legal case involving a dispute over property rights, and you're struck by how systematic and fair the proceeding is. Both sides have legal representation. Evidence is presented and examined. Precedents are cited, and the decision is based on established legal principles rather than arbitrary power. The administrative sophistication is remarkable. The court maintains detailed records of everything from tax assessments to legal decisions to trade regulations. There are specialized officials responsible for different aspects of governance, finance, military affairs, legal matters, and civil administration. This isn't primitive government. It's a complex bureaucratic system that requires literacy, numeracy, and administrative skills. You dress carefully for your appearance at court, because protocol and ceremony matter here. But the ceremony isn't empty ritual. It's a sophisticated system of social organization that maintains order while protecting rights and ensuring that power is exercised within established constraints. As your day in the medieval world continues, you begin to notice something that completely contradicts everything you thought you knew about this period. Technology is everywhere, and it's advancing rapidly. The Dark Ages were actually one of the most innovative periods in human history, with technological developments that laid the foundation for everything that came after. You visit a mill on the outskirts of town, and you're amazed by the sophisticated machinery. This isn't a primitive water wheel turning a stone. It's a complex mechanical system with gear trains, cam mechanisms, and precision engineering that would impress a modern mechanical engineer. Medieval mills weren't just grinding grain. They were powering textile production, metalworking, and even early manufacturing processes. The miller shows you his latest innovation, a system of adjustable gears that allows him to control the speed and power output of his machinery depending on what he's processing. This level of mechanical sophistication was being developed and refined centuries before the Industrial Revolution. You reach for one of the metal objects in the mill's workshop, and you realize you're looking at precision-made components that require advanced metallurgy and machining techniques. Medieval metal workers weren't crude blacksmiths hammering out horseshoes. They were skilled technicians producing complex mechanical parts, surgical instruments, and precision tools. The agricultural technology you see is equally impressive. The heavy plow, the horse collar, the three-field system, selective breeding programs. These innovations increased agricultural productivity so dramatically that they made possible the population growth and urbanization that would define medieval development. European agricultural technology was the most advanced in the world, and it was developed during the supposedly dark centuries. But perhaps most impressive is what you see in the realm of timekeeping and precision instrument. Mechanical clocks are being developed that are accurate to within minutes per day. Astronomical instruments allow precise measurement of celestial positions. Navigation tools enable long-distance sea travel with remarkable accuracy. You visit a workshop where craftsmen are producing eyeglasses. Yes, eyeglasses. Invented in medieval Italy around 186. The optical knowledge required to grind lenses with the correct curvature demonstrates advanced understanding of physics and mathematics. The textile technology is particularly remarkable. Medieval weavers were producing fabrics of extraordinary complexity and beauty using mechanical looms that were marvels of engineering. The spinning wheel, introduced from the Islamic world, revolutionized textile production and created the first real industrial processes in European history. You end your day at a cultural gathering in the Lord's Hall, and what you experience completely destroys any notion that medieval culture was primitive or backward. The artistic and intellectual sophistication rivals anything from the supposed Renaissance that followed. The evening begins with musical performances that showcase the remarkable development of medieval music. Polyphony, the art of combining multiple melodic lines, was being developed to a level of complexity that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. The musicians are performing compositions that require advanced mathematical understanding of rhythm, harmony, and musical structure. You listen to a performance of courtly poetry that demonstrates not just artistic sophistication but also remarkable cultural exchange. The poet is drawing on traditions from Arabic literature, classical Roman sources, and contemporary European innovations to create something entirely new and original. The visual arts you see around you are equally impressive. Medieval manuscript illumination reached levels of precision and beauty that have never been equaled. The techniques for creating and applying gold leaf, the understanding of color theory, the precision of the drawing, these are the works of master artists with training and skills that rival any period in history. But it's not just the technical skill that's impressive, it's the intellectual sophistication. Medieval art wasn't naive or primitive, it was highly symbolic, theologically complex and philosophically sophisticated. Understanding a medieval artwork requires the kind of cultural literacy and intellectual depth that we associate with the highest levels of education. You reach for one of the books on display, beautifully illuminated manuscripts that represent thousands of hours of skilled labor. But these aren't just religious texts. They're works of history, science, philosophy, and literature that demonstrate the breadth and depth of medieval intellectual culture. The literature being produced in this period is particularly remarkable, from the sophisticated psychological realism of medieval romance to the complex philosophical allegories of works like Dante's Divine Comedy. Medieval writers were creating works of extraordinary intellectual and artistic sophistication. But perhaps most impressive is the international character of medieval culture. Ideas, artistic techniques, literary forms and musical styles are flowing freely across Europe and beyond. This isn't an isolated provincial culture, it's a cosmopolitan international civilization that encompasses multiple languages, traditions, and ways of thinking. Now here's where the story gets really interesting and where the Dark Ages myth completely falls apart. Because while all this innovation and learning was happening in medieval Europe, it was being fueled by constant exchange with the Islamic world, which was experiencing its own golden age of science, philosophy, and culture. You meet a translator who has just returned from Spain, where he's been working with Muslim and Jewish scholars to translate Arabic texts into Latin. He's carrying manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that will revolutionize European learning. The famous school of translators in Toledo was essentially medieval Europe's NASA, a center for acquiring and adapting the most advanced knowledge in the world. The mathematical concepts flowing into Europe through these translations are mind-blowing. Arabic numerals, algebra, advanced geometry, trigonometry. These weren't just abstract theories, but practical tools that were revolutionizing everything from architecture to commerce to navigation. You examine some of the medical texts being translated, and you realize you're looking at surgical techniques, pharmaceutical knowledge, and anatomical understanding that is centuries ahead of anything previously available in Europe. Islamic medical knowledge, built on Greek foundations but advanced far beyond them, was transforming European medicine. The astronomical knowledge is equally impressive. Islamic astronomers had developed instruments and mathematical techniques that allowed unprecedented precision in celestial observation and calculation. European scholars weren't just learning this knowledge, they were building on it, creating a collaborative international scientific community that spanned continents and cultures. But it wasn't just one-way transmission. European scholars were also contributing their own innovations and insights to this international exchange. The result was a truly global intellectual community where knowledge flowed freely and innovation built on innovation regardless of religious or cultural boundaries. You reach for one of the philosophical texts being discussed, and you realize you're witnessing the birth of scholasticism, the distinctly medieval approach to learning that would synthesize Aristotelian philosophy, Islamic commentary, Jewish thought, and Christian theology into something entirely new and revolutionary. The technological exchange was equally important. The windmill, the mechanical clock, improved navigation instruments, advanced metallurgy. These innovations were flowing between the Islamic world and Christian Europe, creating a pace of technological advancement that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. As your medieval day continues, you begin to notice something that completely contradicts modern stereotypes about women in the Dark Ages. They're everywhere, and they're doing everything. Medieval women weren't confined to passive, oppressed roles. They were active participants in economic, intellectual, and cultural life to a degree that might surprise modern audiences. You meet Marguerite, a textile merchant who runs her own business, owns property, and travels regularly to trade fairs across Europe. She's not unusual. Medieval women regularly operated businesses, owned property, and participated in economic life as independent agents. The guild system often included women's guilds, and many crafts were dominated by female practitioners. At the monastery, you encounter Abbess Hildegard, who is not just the administrator of a major religious institution, but also a scholar, composer, physician, and natural philosopher. Medieval convents were often centers of learning and culture where women could pursue intellectual and artistic careers that would be denied to them in later periods. The legal status of medieval women was complex, but often more favorable than popular imagination suggests. Women could own property, make contracts, sue in court, and in many cases had legal protections that wouldn't exist in later periods. Medieval law recognized women as legal persons with rights and responsibility. You visit the scriptorium and discover that many of the beautifully illuminated manuscripts are being produced by women. Female scribes, illuminators, and book producers were common throughout medieval Europe, creating works of extraordinary artistic and technical sophistication. The medical knowledge of medieval women was particularly impressive. Female healers, midwives, and physicians practiced throughout Europe, often with formal training and official recognition. Their knowledge of herbal medicine, surgery, and patient care was extensive and effective. But perhaps most remarkable is the intellectual and cultural contribution of medieval women. Female mystics like Mechthild of Magdeburg and Julian of Norwich were producing sophisticated theological and philosophical work. Women troubadours were creating and performing complex musical compositions. Female scholars were participating in the intellectual debates that defined medieval learning. You dress carefully for your visit to the court, where you'll meet noble women who are not passive ornaments but active political agents. Medieval queens and noble women regularly served as regents, diplomatic agents, military commanders, and political advisors. Their influence on medieval politics and culture was substantial and recognized. Your journey through the medieval world takes you north, where you discover that the Vikings, usually portrayed as primitive raiders, were actually sophisticated traders, explorers, and innovators who played a crucial role in medieval development. You board a Viking longship, and immediately you realize you're looking at one of the most advanced pieces of marine technology in the world. These ships could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, were fast enough to outrun pursuit, and sturdy enough to carry substantial cargo loads. The engineering knowledge required to build such vessels was extraordinary. The navigator shows you the sophisticated techniques Vikings used for ocean navigation: sun compasses, wind patterns, star charts, and even the use of polarized light to navigate in cloudy conditions. These weren't primitive raiders stumbling around the ocean. They were skilled navigators who could accurately traverse vast distances with remarkable precision. You reach for one of the trade goods stored in the ship's hold, and you realize you're looking at evidence of a trading network that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, from Iceland to the Caspian Sea. Viking merchants were facilitating cultural and economic exchange on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The archaeological evidence you see contradicts every stereotype about Viking society. These weren't illiterate barbarians. They had a sophisticated oral literary tradition, complex legal systems, and political structures that included some of the earliest experiments in representative government. Viking exploration achievements were remarkable. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus established trading posts from Russia to Ireland and created a network of settlements that facilitated cultural exchange between vastly different regions and peoples. The craftsmanship you observe is extraordinary. Viking metalwork, wood carving, textile production, and jewelry making reached levels of artistic and technical sophistication that rival any period in history. These weren't crude barbarians, they were skilled artisans and innovative technicians. But perhaps most impressive is the political innovation of Viking society. The Thing, their assembly system, was one of the earliest forms of representative government in European history. Legal disputes were resolved through systematic legal procedures, and political decisions were made through consultation and consensus rather than arbitrary authority. You travel to the court of Charlemagne, and what you discover completely demolishes any notion that the 8th and 9th centuries were a period of ignorance and decline. The Carolingian Renaissance was one of the most important cultural and intellectual revivals in European history, laying the foundation for everything that followed. The palace school you visit is extraordinary. Scholars from across Europe and beyond have gathered to preserve, copy, and study classical texts while also producing new works of history, theology, philosophy, and literature. This isn't just preservation of ancient knowledge, it's active scholarship and innovation. You meet Alcuin of York, the school's director, who explains his educational reforms. The curriculum he's developed combines classical learning with Christian scholarship, emphasizing not just memorization but critical thinking and original analysis. The pedagogical methods being developed here will influence European education for centuries. The scriptoriums you visit are producing manuscripts at an unprecedented rate, but they're not just copying existing texts. They're correcting errors, adding commentaries, and creating new works. The Carolingian minuscule script being developed here is so clear and readable that it became the basis for all later European writing systems. You reach for one of the historical works being produced, and you realize you're looking at sophisticated historical analysis that draws on multiple sources, evaluates evidence critically, and attempts to understand causation and significance. Medieval historians weren't just recording events, they were analyzing and interpreting them. The legal reforms being implemented are equally impressive. The Capitularies, Charlemagne's legal codes, represent a systematic attempt to create uniform, fair, and effective legal systems across a vast territory. These weren't arbitrary royal decrees, they were carefully crafted legal instruments based on consultation with legal experts and local authorities. The administrative innovations are remarkable. The system of missi dominati, royal inspectors who traveled throughout the empire to ensure effective governance, represents one of the earliest attempts at systematic administrative oversight in European history. But perhaps most impressive is the international character of the court. Scholars, artists, and officials have come from Ireland, England, Italy, Spain, and beyond to participate in this intellectual and cultural revival. This isn't isolated provincialism, it's cosmopolitan internationalism at its finest. You visit the court of Frederick II in Sicily, and what you discover will completely change your understanding of medieval science. Far from being a period of superstition and ignorance, the medieval world was developing the systematic approaches to natural investigation that would become the foundation of modern science. The scholars you meet aren't just reading ancient texts. They're conducting experiments, making observations, and developing theories based on empirical evidence. The scientific method, far from being a Renaissance invention, was being developed and refined by medieval thinkers centuries earlier. You observe Robert Grossist conducting optical experiments, using carefully controlled conditions to study the behavior of light and developing mathematical theories to explain his observation. This isn't accidental discovery, it's systematic scientific investigation based on hypothesis experimentation and mathematical analysis. Roger Bacon shows you his experimental apparatus, devices for studying optics, chemistry, and mechanics that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of controlled experimentation. His emphasis on empirical observation and mathematical analysis prefigures everything we consider modern about scientific method. The astronomical work you observe is particularly impressive. Medieval astronomers were making precise observations, developing mathematical models, and creating instruments of remarkable accuracy. The Alfonsine tables, produced in 13th century Spain, provided astronomical calculations that remained the standard for centuries. You reach for one of the mathematical treatises being studied, and you realize you're looking at work that introduces algebraic concepts, geometric theorems, and computational techniques that were advancing mathematical knowledge beyond anything achieved in the ancient world. The medical schools you visit are conducting systematic and anatomical studies, developing surgical techniques, and creating pharmaceutical knowledge based on careful observation and experimentation rather than just traditional authority. But perhaps most remarkable is the theoretical framework being developed for scientific investigation. Medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas were creating philosophical systems that emphasized the importance of empirical observation, logical analysis, and systematic doubt, the intellectual foundations of scientific thinking. The institutional support for learning is extraordinary. Universities, cathedral schools, monastery libraries, and royal courts are all supporting scientific investigation and providing the resources necessary for systematic research. As your medieval journey continues, you begin to understand that the Dark Ages weren't just not dark in Europe. They were part of a global web of cultural and economic exchange that connected civilizations across continents in ways that prefigure modern globalization. You visit Venice, one of the great medieval trading cities, and what you see is a truly international community. Merchants from Constantinople bring silk and spices from Asia. Traders from North Africa arrive with gold and ivory. Northern Europeans bring furs and amber. The level of international commerce and cultural exchange is remarkable. The monetary systems you encounter are sophisticated enough to handle international trade on a massive scale. Letters of credit, banking networks, and currency exchange systems facilitate commerce across vast distances and between different economic systems. You meet Marco Polo, recently returned from his travels to China, and his accounts of Asian technology, political systems, and cultural achievements are reshaping European understanding of the world. Medieval Europe wasn't isolated. It was actively seeking knowledge and contact with other civilizations. The maps you see being produced demonstrate increasingly accurate geographical knowledge. Medieval cartographers were incorporating information from travelers, traders, and scholars to create maps that showed a remarkably sophisticated understanding of global geography. You reach for one of the technological innovations recently introduced from Asia: paper, gunpowder, the compass, printing techniques, and you realize you're witnessing the transfer of knowledge and technology that's revolutionizing European civilization. The intellectual exchange is equally impressive. Scholars are traveling to study in centers of learning from Cordoba to Cairo to Baghdad. Texts are being translated not just from Arabic to Latin, but between multiple languages, creating a truly international scholarly community. The Mongol Empire, often portrayed as a destructive force, actually facilitated unprecedented cultural and economic exchange across Eurasia. The Pax Mongolica created conditions for trade and cultural exchange that wouldn't be equaled until the modern era. Medieval exploration was pushing the boundaries of the known world. Vikings reached North America, European missionaries traveled to Central Asia, and traders established regular contact with civilizations across Africa and Asia. You attend a philosophical debate at the University of Paris, and what you witness completely transforms your understanding of medieval intellectual life. Far from being a period of intellectual stagnation, the medieval world was experiencing one of the most creative and influential philosophical revolutions in human history. The debate you're witnessing is between followers of different philosophical schools: Thomists, Scotists, Nominalists, Averroists, each representing sophisticated philosophical systems that were advancing human understanding of logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Thomas Aquinas, whose philosophical system you encounter, isn't just preserving ancient wisdom, he's creating an entirely new synthesis that combines Aristotelian philosophy, Islamic commentary, and Christian theology into something original and revolutionary. His systematic approach to philosophical problems and his emphasis on logical analysis became foundational to Western thought. You observe the scholastic method in action, the systematic approach to learning that emphasized critical